Okay, so I think we will make a start. So firstly, welcome everybody. Just to advise you that this session is being recorded, and we do ask you not to post any private or confidential information, just because Zoom is it's a public platform. If you do have any questions that you would like to ask, those can be posted in the Q&A box, and the Q&A session will commence after the talk. I'm just going to introduce you over to Professor Drew Harrison, who's going to welcome our speaker, Dr. Denise Doyle. Over to you, Drew.
Okay, thank you. I'm, as you said, Dr. Drew Harrison, and excuse me, I'm Professor of Digital Media Art and I'm also Director of CADRE. And CADRE is the Centre for Art, Design, Research and Experimentation that accommodates researchers from the Wolverhampton School of Art. It was established in 2006 to explore and develop the beneficial effect of art and design upon society. And the centre is clustered into three focused areas of interests. We have art, philosophy and social practice, digital technology theory and practice, and material and theoretical practice. And our speaker today, I'm very pleased to introduce to you all, is Denise Doyle, and she's a reader in digital technology theory and practice cluster. And Denise will be presenting her project on identifying successful starts methodologies. But before she begins, I think it's worth mentioning just how important this project and Denise's research is, as it concerns the reinstating of interdisciplinarity between the arts and the sciences, and offers a way forward for how this might be achieved in and through practice, actually. And I'm talking about reinstating because previously these two areas of study were not separated out, they were studied together. And no more so than if we go back to the Renaissance, 1400s to 1600s, medieval time, where all its subjects were explored together, there was no separation. And you think of a Renaissance man perhaps being Leonardo da Vinci, who was both scientist, I'm sure you've all seen his lovely drawings, and artist, a really well-known painter. Those subjects were studied together pretty much until the Industrial Revolution, when the kind of mass-produced factory work sought out the scientific inventions behind that, and the artists became the artisans who were separated out from that. To the point that in 1861, I think this is a defining moment, the South Kensington Museum split into two separate museums, one for art and one for science. That's an extraordinary thing to happen. So a direct split between the two subject areas. And these specialisms continued and developed even until the 20th century, where specialisms were then facilitated within university and school curricula. So it's very difficult to study art and science together. You went down one route or the other. The worry about this, I think, is best identified in the middle of the last century, in a very kind of seminal paper now by C.P. Snow that was written or delivered in 1959. It was actually a lecture to the Cambridge University, although it was in Oxford done. And this is an essay, The Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution. And this discussed the cultural divide between the arts and the sciences, which Snow considered were the two great areas of human intellectual activity. And he argued that practitioners in both areas should build bridges to further the progress of human knowledge and to benefit society, which is a massive claim. And if we move into later on, 20 years ahead from that, Ars Electronica in 1979 had the first festival of science sci-art. And then in 1996, they opened the physical building, Museum of the Future in Linz in Austria. And then in the 21st century, we have, it started in America, but it actually encroached over here as well, the idea of science and art education. So we had a great focus here on the STEM subjects, which you've probably all heard of, which is science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And in America, they started to put A for arts in there to make STEAM. And although that's still mooted, it hasn't really taken off, but the idea is there, and it's been there for some time. And now, in the 21st century and in 2021, we find the research councils and the European funders and other world funders are encouraging interdisciplinary narrative in their projects. And for the first time, we have a government audit of our university research called well, it was called the Research Assessment Exercise, but now it's the Research Excellence Framework. And for REF, which is REF 2021, had a tick box for research project outputs that were considered interdisciplinary. So interdisciplinary has been on the REF framework, and that's never happened before. So it is a really big theme, a really big issue that we have to address and pay attention to. And our PhD art and design studies and students now frequently use a mixed methods approach. So they use the qualitative from the art and the quantitative from the sciences. I want to say a little bit more about this to make the distinction, because if people go on to study, this is actually, you know, what they have to consider. So whereas with the, in science, with the quantitative methods, science is objective, art is subjective. Science is theoretical, art is conceptual. Science is evidence-based, and art needs no proof. Science is observable and measurable, and art leads to more questions. Science is data-driven, whereas in the art world it's peer-reviewed and narrative-based. So scientists explore the world by using the scientific method. Now this has been devised over hundreds of years and it works well. The method is to define a problem, which is to find a question to be answered, to form a hypothesis, so predict the outcome, research into what is already known, conduct experiments and make observations, analyse data and formulate conclusions, and share findings, which then brings feedback. Now, when the feedback's returned, and this could be years after the papers are first published, they then often return to the original hypothesis, and revisions begin with the experimental process again. So the sciences have a way to explore a problem, form and test a hypothesis, and answer questions to share. But in the arts, we do something very similar. We have the creative process, which is a way to explore an idea, to create, interpret, and express, communicate, and so share. Inquiry is at the heart of both of these methods, and that's the essential object of this. The investigation into the humans and how we live on this planet and what our planet is about the inquiry at the heart of these two methods. With Ars Electronica's Future Lab opening in 1996 to support an interdisciplinary team of artists and scientists in collaborating on researching the future, Ars Electronica is ahead of the game and has been awarding the Prix Ars Electronica annually since 1987. And this is the artist and scientist. So what can be learned from them about the nature of these collaborations to, as Snow stated, to further the progress of human knowledge and to benefit society? And that today is what we're going to hear from Denise. It's what Denise's project is all about. We're really lucky to have her speak for us. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce her to you. And I'm really interested in what she's going to say. So thank you. And over to Denise, please.
Thank you, Ju. That's really interesting. And I think there'll be quite a few points that you alluded to that we can kind of discuss a little bit later on. So that's a great introduction. My own interest in interdisciplinary practice has really been focused on arts and technology over the last 20 years. But more recently, over the last 6 or 7 years, it's been kind of extended to the intersection of arts, science, and technology. And the image you can see here is of an exhibition that the university hosted, or held rather, in the Made in Wolves Gallery, showcasing the project, identifying successful starts methodologies. And we ran this project from 2019 until earlier this year. And obviously I'm going to talk quite a lot about that shortly, and also the follow-on projects that we're beginning. So see if this works. Okay. So really, to follow on from what Ju was talking about, I was making another presentation on a similar theme recently and came across this headline from the science journal Nature. Collaborations with artists go beyond communicating the science. And for those in public, for those in research, public engagement with science has become essential. And it isn't a surprise that scientists are increasingly seeking out artists and designers to help them to communicate to new audiences. But as the article outlined, sorry, I've got someone banging on my door. I'll just have to stop this for 1 second, sorry.
If you just bear with us a moment and the speaker will be back to resume the presentation. Thank you.
Huge apologies, sorry, there was a plumber that needed to come, and he came at this time. So am I back live now?
Yes, Denise, you are back live with us.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, so going back to the article, the alliances that it suggests is actually most valuable when scientists and artists actually have a shared stake in a project, and that they're able to jointly design it and can actually critique each other's work. And such an approach can both prompt new research as well as result in powerful art. And it's interesting that this article also cited this project Centrebeam, which was developed by the then Centre for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT in 1977. And this was set up to explore the role of technology in culture at that time. Now, Centrebeam was a 44-metre long installation illustrating energy transfer, and included laser drawings against clouds of steam that you can see in the photo, and holograms lit by mirrors tracking the sun, and huge nylon sculptures lifted into the air with helium-filled polyethylene tubing. So, of course, not going back as far as Dew talked about, but it's not the first time that collaborations were encouraged between art, science and technology in the last century. The first exhibition in the UK that experimented presenting the work of scientists and engineers and musicians and artists alongside each other was held at the ICA in London in 1968, and that's at the Institute of Contemporary Arts. And it was entitled Cybernetic Serendipity, and it was curated by Jascha Reichart, who you can see in the bottom right-hand side. And the exhibition, this is the exhibition catalogue as well. And interestingly, Jascha is still living and working on similar projects even today, which is pretty amazing. So the exhibitions itself featured the work of artists and scientists and really showed them on an equal footing. And it was the breaking down of barriers between disciplines that was an important factor of the exhibition. So machines were shown alongside artworks, and there was no differentiation made between the objects or the processes used or the materials or the methods used either, or between the background of the makers. So now I want to just briefly introduce you to some of the work I've been doing and the projects that have been included in the Journal of Virtual Creativity, and some of the projects that led to the ISSM project. So in 2016, I was asked by Intellect Publishers if I would take on the Journal of Metaverse Creativity. and take it in a new direction. And the journal had been founded in 2010, and it was very much of the moment, focusing very much on creative artistic practices in virtual worlds. But really it was, you know, it didn't really hold beyond that time. So we decided to call it the Journal of Virtual Creativity, and extended the journal's reach into immersive technologies, but also into the realm of arts, science and technology. So really for that first launch issue, we planned two quite different issues. One, for the first focusing on the idea of embodied experience in extreme spaces, and the second to develop an issue around Isaiah 2018. And this was being held in Colombia in South America that year. So for those of you who don't know what Isaiah is, it's the annual International Symposium of Electronic Arts, and it's held in different cities all over the world annually. So in 2015, I'd organised a symposium at the Towards the Science of Consciousness conference that was actually held in Helsinki in that year. And the symposium was entitled Astronauts and Avatars, the Art and Science of Embodiment. And I had for a few years been playing with the idea of juxtaposing embodiment in zero gravity and the embodiment or even disembodiment through the avatar. So I invited a space doctor, an artist who is engaged in space and who had actually already experienced a zero gravity flight, a filmmaker engaged in neuroscience and the virtual, and a dancer and philosopher, Susan Cazell, who had developed a performance experiment entitled Ghosts and Astronauts in the late 1990s. And you can see an image of that performance on the right-hand side. So for the founding issue, I had invited artist astronaut Sarah Jane Pell, who is Australian, to contribute a visual essay about her work on embodiment. And we used a still from her film, We Are All Explorer Fish, from 2016 for the front cover that you can see on the left. And this is a fictional account of the first human trip to Mars. And it's really interesting, her work. She is a fully fledged trained astronaut, and she participates equally in scientific research about space. And I think her work is really interested in different types of embodied experience, and playing with ideas of paralleling the astronaut in zero gravity and what she calls the aquanaut underwater. And this is one of her projects here. So for the second issue, we, like I said, sort of took work that had been presented at Isaiah 2018. And Lynn Heller, who is now the reviews editor for the journal, was going to Colombia anyway. And so she tried to draw out any projects that were kind of developed around immersive technologies. And here you can see the work of Johannes Beringer in the bottom left-hand corner. And the rest of the images are from Boredom Research, a really interesting art science duo partnership based in the UK, aka Vicky Isley and Paul Smith, and their project White Cart Loom. And this was commissioned by the City of Paisley in Scotland, and I think it was for some kind of City of Culture bid, and uses real-time 3D software to generate animated pearlescent forms that swim across the screen, but installed as though they're being woven by a jacquard loom. So we try to have one special issue every 1 or 2 years, depending on the ideas that are put forward. And in 2018, I went to OCAD-U, which is the Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto, and games designer there Cindy Paremba took on the guest editorship of that 10.1 issue and focused on celebrating a decade of the Digital Futures initiative that had been established by Sarah Diamond there. So for this year, it's hot off the press, hasn't even been printed yet, is a special issue in collaboration with the University of Newcastle, just outside of Sydney. And the theme is XR and creativity, transformative technologies for good, and XR standing for extended reality, so VR, AR, etc. And Ben Matthews and Xiang Zi contacted me in 2020 before they had a symposium of the same name, and we agreed to have this special issue. And it was a fabulous response from the participants there. And this is the kind of contents page. You might not be able to read it, but what was really great about collaborating with them was that we had work from New Zealand, Australia, Indonesia and Malaysia. So it was really rich and has been a really different issue. So moving on then, in late 2018, the university launched a new international research and innovation scheme, or IRIS for short, to encourage cross-faculty collaboration within the university and to enable a group of researchers to join an existing EU-funded project under Horizon 2020. And this was to help build and strengthen international research and collaboration, and was most definitely a response to the outcome of the UK referendum and the likelihood of Brexit, which obviously we all know how that's played out. So we were fortunate to be awarded funding to enable us to collaborate with the STARTS Prize, that I'll talk about in a moment, and with the coordinating group of that, which is Ars Electronica. And obviously Ju has really outlined their role in this field very clearly in her introduction. For us to undertake this project, identifying successful smart STARTS methodologies. And the we is Richard Glover from the School of Performing Arts, Bas Gross from the School of Humanities, and Martin Kachara from the Faculty of Science. So we were also lucky enough to employ 2 research assistants to support the project, and that's Charlotte Dunn, who still works for the university, and Jacob Badcock, who went on to do his PhD in London after the project had finished. So during our research project, we focused very much on identifying the collaborative methodologies that were common to the STARTS prizes. And we undertook over 20 interviews with artists and scientists, which resulted in a series of case studies of the projects that, that had been selected over a 4-year period. And that little inset image is of Ars Electronica in Linz, by the way. So for those of you who don't know, the STARTS is an initiative of the European Commission. And as you can see, it is science plus technology plus the arts is STARTS. And to quote the Commission, it aims to foster alliances of technology and artistic practice. The focus is on people and projects that contribute to a mastering of the social, ecological and economic challenges that Europe faces. So over the 5 years of the project, the STARTS Prize has held an annual competition to recognise innovative projects that make a significant impact on both economic and or social innovation. And the 2 prize winners each win €20,000 each. And there are 2 categories. One is innovative collaboration and the other is artistic exploration. So for innovative collaboration, it is between industry or technology and the arts that open new pathways for innovation. And the 2 examples here are the Amsterdam 3D printed bridge from 2018 on the left. And if you look really closely, you can see a man walking across quite a precarious bridge, I must admit. And on the right is Olga Kiseleva's Eden project from 2020. So for artistic exploration, it's where the appropriation by the arts has a strong potential to influence or alter the use, deployment, or perception of technology. And the two examples here are of Iris van Herpen's Magnetic Motion fashion series from 2016, and Future Flora, which is Julia Tomasello's project, which was also presented at the Made in Morse Gallery as part of our exhibition. So actually the Starts Prize does continue for another 4 years, and Ars Electronica are the ones still coordinating it under Horizon Europe now. So the Starts Prize is part of a wider Starts scheme and includes a project that's currently running called the Starts Ecosystem, and we have some association with it. And I think the idea is that, you know, an ecosystem is created and in the end that it becomes self-sustaining. And another big project that the Starts did was the Vertigo project, which supported 45 artists having residencies in technology organisations throughout Europe, and this was over a 3-year period. And what you see here is the exhibition, the Starts exhibition at Ars Electronica in Linz, which was in 2019. And a few of us were lucky enough to visit through the project. So the threats of the COVID crisis have also brought about new opportunities, such as being able to participate in a distributed Ars Electronica festival last year. And we were always going to try and do a project exhibition, but we decided to do it a little bit early to coincide with the Ars Electronica Festival, which is in September. And yeah, in its 41-year history, it's never been distributed. And I think it certainly changed it and made it really pretty exciting. And they're going to do a very similar thing again this year, because obviously people still can't really travel. So our exhibition, you'll see in a second, presents the project alongside some of the Starts projects themselves. Oh, I'll just go back. Yeah, so this is, like I said, it's in the MS building, and I love this image of Olga Kiseleva. It's a huge image of part of the Eden project as well. So in front, on the podiums is the Future Flora project. On the left-hand side, you can see some of the case studies, and at the back are the Starts Prize winners. And you can see the timeline that we did for the project as well. And one really nice thing about participating in this distributed festival is that they kind of had a garden theme. So we were part of the UK part of that, but because we'd also done other activities, we were called Garden Wolverhampton, which I kind of like. So yeah, we had 3 Starts projects, as I said, Future Flora, and This Is Grown, which I'll talk about in a while, and a project called Virophilia, again, which I'll talk about shortly. Oops. So we did want to include a project from the 2020 prize, and we were keen to host the work of Taiwanese artist Pei Ying Lin. Given the significance of her project Virophilia, given at that time COVID-19 was having a huge impact when we were trying to decide what projects to select, and this was in sort of May, June of last year. And so her project Virophilia investigates the possibilities of human virus encounters. And one part of the installation is a 7-meter high scroll that lists all known viruses in the world. And there's a space on the right-hand side that's blank for the inevitable other viruses that will be discovered in the future. So another part of the project is a cookbook written for the 22nd century, where humans have learnt to live with and accept viruses as part of a greater ecosystem. My personal favourite is influenza egg on rice, that you can see a little rice bowl in the inset image here. But equally, there was, so many provocative parts of the cookbook, and Pei Ying wanted us to display the printed sections of the book in this way, and I think it worked really, really well. So for the kind of the second part of the talk, I want to introduce some of the case studies. I'm going to talk about the murder of Pavlos Fyssas, which is a really important project by Forensic Architecture. And then I'll talk about Library of Ourselves, Tree Lab, and This Is Grown, sort of not in the same breath, but together, because it kind of formed the basis of something we were talking about in terms of the third space of art science practice. So the murder of Pavlos Fyssas happened in 2013 in Athens. He, again, inset here, he's a Greek anti-fascist rapper, and both the killer and others who participated in the attack were members of the neo-Nazi organisation Golden Dawn. And following the murder of Fyssas, the government was forced to make a series of arrests, and 69 members of Golden Dawn, including 15 parliamentarians, were brought to trial. Now, Forensic Architecture were commissioned by the Fyssas family to reconstruct the events of the night from the audio and video material made available to the court. And the resulting video investigation and report was presented in the Athens courtroom in September 2018. Now, the investigation established that members of Golden Dawn, including senior officials, acted in a coordinated manner in relation to the murder, and that members of Greece's elite special forces, police, were present at the scene before, during, and after the murder and failed to intervene. Forensic Architecture proved that the police versions of events were false, and the final hearing was actually in October of last year and found Golden Dawn guilty of the murder of Fyssas and 3 other high-profile crimes. And it was billed as the biggest trial of fascists since the prosecution of the Nazis at Nuremberg after the Second World War. Now, Forensic Architecture was founded in 2010 by A.L. Weissman, and they're an interdisciplinary research agency based at Goldsmiths at the University of London. And they use architectural techniques to investigate human rights violations and cases of state violence. And their collaborative practice is self-described as an investigative aesthetics and has produced vital legal jurisdictional evidence on many issues. What is interesting about Forensic Architecture is that whilst they present their evidence in courts of law, they also present them in cultural forums as well, understanding the art world as an alternative institutional space for the dissemination of truths that are counter to those presented by governments and media. So I want to attribute part of this case study to the work of one of our research assistants during the project, Jacob Badcock, who interviewed Christina Varvia, the Deputy Director of Forensic Architecture in London last year. So our case study emphasised forensic architecture's archaeological approach to media objects, such as video and satellite imagery, demonstrating their ability through sophisticated audio-visual modelling to make otherwise imperceptible events perceptible. And in this image, it's one of the many exhibitions that they participate in. This one is Enter the Void in Germany. And it's interesting that they call themselves the Forensic Architecture Collective, when they present their work in cultural forums. And this links in well to the next case study of BeAnotherLab, who were awarded an honorary mention for their project Library of Ourselves in 2017. So I was really interested in their work from the start because of their involvement in embodied practices. But I also became really interested in their work as an art collective and how that actually impacted on the work that they do. So the collective used this quote by Rizzolatti, the neurophysiologist who discovered mirror neurons in their early works. And the longer quote describes how the perception of emotions, of seeing someone else's emotions, can activate the same part of our brain as when we experience the same emotions ourselves. And to directly quote Rizzolatti, he writes, "This shows how strong and deep-rooted is the bond that ties us to others, or in other words, how bizarre it would be to conceive of an I without an us." So I think this really encapsulates, the aims of BeAnotherLab in terms of their really committed motivation and desire to encourage empathy in others. And this image is it's a video from a first-person perspective of a woman looking at a photo of her son, who she lost in Brazil. He was murdered in Brazil. And BeAnotherLab had filmed her. It's a very powerful piece. So BeAnotherLab were formed in 2013 from a group of master's students, actually, from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. And they kind of came together through their mutual interest in embodied narrative and embodied cognition. And you'll see that, with all 9 of them, they kind of cover an awful lot of specialisms, including cognitive science and psychology, interface design, and anthropology. So BeAnotherLab's empathy VR work is based on what they call the machine to be another, which is what they call their embodiment system. And to quote them, they describe it as designed to address the relation between identity and empathy. The machine merges performances with protocols of neuroscience experiments in order to offer users an immersive experience of seeing themselves in the body of another person. So to explain a little bit more about their work, their first series of projects is called the Machine Classic, and this was a body swap in VR for one person, and then there was a second person who is the performer, and you can see that in the top right-hand image, an example of this. And the machine to be another is the two-way swap, so there isn't a performer as such, but there is performance there, but it's between 2 users. And so BeAnotherLab got quite a lot of media attention for their gender body swap, which you can see in the top left-hand corner. So, and then they obviously won the Starts honorary mention for Library of Ourselves, which they call a form of embodied storytelling. So it is pre-recorded narrative that the user listens to from a first-person perspective. And the second person is the performer, who enhances the experience through touch and smell. So you'll often find in their videos that they'll have hands that have been touched. So the performer can also kind of encourage that real embodied experience further, and they also use smell as well. So I met 5 members of the collective at their studios in Barcelona in 2019. And I was fortunate enough to sit in on a group debrief from Norma and Daniela. And they just spent 2 weeks in Jordan filming 3 different women's stories of being either Syrian or Iraqi refugee in 3 cities there. And this was actually commissioned by Dr. Yaffa Shanique, who's a religious studies lecturer at the University of Birmingham, and she'd got some funding from the British Council. And her work really tries to look at dynamics of gender in Islam, and particularly amongst diasporic communities, and really how different Muslim marriage practices change depending on its cultural context. So actually talking to Norma de Secche, really fascinating, because she's been doing her PhD observing as an anthropologist, BeAnotherLab over the last few years. And I was just really interested in how the collective shared their knowledge across these fields. And actually 2 members of the collective, Marte and Philippe, had both decided to undertake a PhD in neuroscience following their master's programs, because they wanted to try and understand what the embodiment system was doing in scientific terms. So just to quote Norma, she kind of said, well, actually, it's not that Philippe's scientific work determines what the machine is. It's just a way of expressing a certain way of producing knowledge in another field. And then she goes on to say, that's what I do in anthropology. I take the machine and I try to explain it through anthropology. So I ended up writing an article about the BeAnotherLab Collective, and used some of those interviews. And it was really interesting. Marte Roel, who now is very much a hybrid, trained in both the arts and in the sciences, really what the difference was between working in either side of those fields. And again, I thought it was really interesting what he wrote. I'm going to read it out. So he writes, I do believe in empirical science. It's not that I don't. I think we would fall into arbitrariness if we didn't trust some of the principles of science, but I also find it limiting. Some of the things I'm studying are very related in terms of the techniques that we do in BeAnotherLab. So there is some validation of some of the methods that we do. I think mostly it's about legitimacy. And I think this is quite interesting, and perhaps we'll pick this up in the Q&A. But I'll relate that in a moment to what somebody says around the This Is Grown project. But I was also interested in Christian Shireen, who, when I interviewed him, we were talking about how you work across or between different fields of research. And again, to quote him, he says that really working in those, what he calls spaces between, you expand the disciplines that already exist and hopefully change them as well, because they're problematic in their own ways. And I think BeAnotherLab are very acutely aware of the limitations of their own disciplines and the failings and the implicit biases that are in there. And as Christian says, what it discounts particularly. So also as part of the festival last September, we held an artist-scientist roundtable, and this included Christian and Norma, and it also included Julia Tomasello from Future Flora, and also her material scientist Tommaso Busolo, and it included Pei Ying Lin and her collaborator scientist and virologist Miranda de Graaf. And because during our research, a number of the artists and scientists described how they have to build a third space in order for them to find a common language together, this is something that we explored in the roundtable. So I think it's a good point to focus on this concept of the third space. So Richard, Martin and myself wrote an article trying to draw out this concept in the case studies that we undertook in Tree Lab, Library of Ourselves, and This Is Grown. We've submitted it to Leonardo 2-3 months ago and waiting to hear if that's been accepted. But also it's interesting that Norma de Secche during the round table explained that she thought the collective was the third space discussed in the collaborative practices, rather than just the space that was created between two collaborators across two fields of practice. But to briefly move on then to the two final case studies I'm going to talk about. The TreeLab project, rendering eco-physiological processes audible, or TreeLab, sought to connect sounds that occur in trees with eco-physiological processes and to investigate render perceptible experiences of plants that are not noticeable to humans. And the project was a collaboration between tree physiologist Roman Zweifel and sound artist Marcus Mader. And it actually began as an investigation into climate change on Scots pines in the Swiss Alps. But Zweifel also wanted to explore sounds made by trees that occur due to drought stress. And as the project developed, the researchers realized that if they could make these stress-induced plant signals perceivable to humans, then an abstract concept like climate change could be made more tangible through an installation, exhibition, or an environment. And you can see a couple of the examples there. The main one is of Ars Electronica, and I'm not sure where the other one is. So Richard interviewed the two researchers. Don't have time to go into the project too much, but I just wanted to pull out a comment from each collaborator. Firstly, I'm really interested in this quote from Marcus Mader, his conception of artistic research as investigating the same object as a natural scientist, but by different means. And Mader explicitly sees the goals for artists is to attain the same language as the scientist uses. And this approach underlies his philosophy that artists and scientists actually have to meet on a different plane to one inhabited by either party. And this is where the whole third space idea came from. And this different plane best facilitates cooperation by both researchers. And finally, and interestingly, Roman Zweifel, yes, of course, he is taking the opportunity to communicate his science with the support of an artist, but he goes much further than that and says how much more innovation we could do if we could just allow other concepts and ideas to influence our own work. So the final case study is the This Is Grown project by designer Jen Keane, and she focuses on the development of biological alternatives to synthetic materials, and her work created cellulose producing bacteria to create biosynthetic material. And then she developed a technique called microbial weaving to create an entirely new material. And as you can see in this image, she used this material in the upper part of a trainer. For her This Is Grown project. So we were lucky enough to be able to present it in the exhibition. Unfortunately, it had to be sent back by now, alongside some of the samples of the microbial weaving. So it was Martin Kachara and Charlotte Dunn who interviewed Jen Keane and some of her collaborators in 2020. Again, I've picked out a couple of quotes. So Keane says, I think it's important to have that distinction between what is science and what is design. And I think anybody can do either, but they take a lot of practice to be an expert in either two. And again, perhaps Jen is quite akin to Marty Roel, and is kind of much more of a hybrid researcher. And talking about how different areas of practice intersect, as you can read in this second quote, that working at the intersection between the design and science in biodesign becomes a richer proposition for her research. So I think what Joy Ito, the then director of MIT Media Lab, who in 2016 noted as the difference between interdisciplinary practices and what he termed antidisciplinary practices. So interdisciplinary being when people from different disciplines work together and use each other's methods. But to quote, but antidisciplinary is something very different. It's about working in spaces that simply do not fit into any existing academic discipline, a specific field of study with its own particular words, frameworks, and methods. And I have a sense that many of the STARTS projects are undertaking antidisciplinary practices. These could be actually emerging practices through arts, science and technology, but this is also facilitated by the development of the third space in collaborative practices. So to end, I just want to very briefly introduce you to what are the plans to develop this research further. We're about to submit an AHRC research application for TASCI, and this is to undertake a series of art science residencies in the UK. And so they will be at Dartington College, FACT in Liverpool, here at Wolverhampton, and also at the University of Creative Arts and at SODA in Manchester. And we're going to focus on addressing issues of the climate crisis in particular. And we're working with some really interesting partners. Very excited to be working with Leonardo and again, Ars Electronica and a whole group of other organisations, including the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change. And one of the co-Is, who's the scientist, she's a chemist, is from the University of San Francisco. So wish us luck that we actually get the money. And that's it. Thank you.
Oh, I'm not sure where our speaker's gone, so thanks ever so much, Denise. That was really interesting. And I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A box yet, so I'll just ask a general one about your last slide to try and start people off. I wondered if you were talking about the antidisciplinary from the MIT director. Is that equivalent of the third space? And what exactly would be this third space? Is it a form of blended methods between the arts and sciences?
Yeah, I mean, we're quite open to trying to.
If you just bear with us, I think we've just lost Denise for a moment.
Okay.
Are you still with us, Denise? I think we just lost you for a moment there.
Oh, yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, yes.
Yeah, that's interesting that we kind of thought that this third space was, it isn't just a space in between, it's a newly created space that the collaborators create to kind of speak in, they almost create another language. That's what we think is happening, or it's a shared language. And this very much came out of the Tree Lab discussions, because Richard actually interviewed them together, and that was the only time they were any of the collaborators were interviewed together. And that's what we've decided to do as part of the next phase, is to interview people together, long-term or mid-term collaborators, to see how that space is created. You know, is it antidisciplinary? It seems that the antidisciplinary is emergent in, you know, eventually biodesign becomes a field, or other areas become a field through that emergent practice, but it has to be that first stage where it isn't a field. It's a field that is being found, and most often it's technology that is enabling that new field to emerge, I think. And I think that's why perhaps this area of arts, technology, science is so exciting, because of that. because it continually is changing and evolving. So we're not too certain about what that third space really is. And of course, we're trying to draw on research from other fields of research around the third space to see if it's actually a space that is created that is more open.
Okay, I'm just wondering, because really the use of third space has been in theatre for a long time, and also within forms of immersive practice, because you have the, you know, the stage plays of the artist, and you have the audience, and then the third space is where they impact upon each other, you know, in filmmaking. And so I just wondered if it was being used in a similar fashion, but it seems that it's not. I may get this wrong, but it could be that it's actually a new space, and it's more of a kind of a grundrisse. It's more of a grounding where people can start with basic terms, you know, making their own terms and basic things, rather than that kind of melding a space, which we haven't.
I think that's what we realised and thought this was really worth trying to see what that really was, because we don't know at the moment. We think it is this new space where sort of a new language is formed between the artist and the scientist. But equally, you know, we found that a lot of the projects themselves, there were a lot of hybrid people who were, you know, happily working in the arts and happily working in the science. And particularly Marcus was saying, well, you know, if you are going to work with scientists, you need to learn that language. And I think he took 2 or 3 years to really come to grips with the, you know, the physiology, the plant physiology that Roman Zweifel was working on as well.
I don't think we have any more questions. And do we, what should we do? Shall we, because we've run out of time as well.
We have, yes.
I'm sure people could contact you, perhaps, Denise.
Yes, that's fine. I think there's a question here. Are there any ways interested students can get involved with art science projects, or ways to find people that want to collaborate? Actually, as part of our project, we did run a couple of science workshops with artists, and that was run by Charlotte Dunn and Martin Kashara. And that was really, really interesting. And I know that Maggie in the School of Art is really keen to be developing these kinds of initiatives. We do have a website, WLV Art Science, but it's not that active at the moment. It was a project website. But I think it's to kind of just keep in touch with the research community and see what opportunities are coming up, because I think they're coming up all the time through various different projects.
I can add a bit to that. I mean, I have a lot of professors from the sciences, from FS Faculty of Science Engineering, coming to me to see if there's anybody would like to work with them on projects in the arts and design field. And we have one at the moment, which is about using copper and 3D printing of fabrics, to because copper is antiseptic, to make face masks and clothing for people working in intensive care units, for instance. And we're looking for fashion design and design students to work in them. So they do come across. Anybody else? Any other questions while we've still got Denise here?
I don't think there is. I think everybody's finished their lunch and they're going back to work.
Well, I'd just like to thank you for a really fascinating, interesting talk, Denise. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and I'm sure you've inspired lots of people to think about what their kind of practice is in the new century, when we have so many innovations coming between arts and sciences, and technologies facilitating a lot of those. So thank you ever so much for that.
No problem. Thank you, Ju. Thanks.
Okay. Shall we say goodbye?
It's a very strange forum, isn't it?
Very strange forum.